Right, time for a new video. So let's talk about the benefits of economic blocks. I know I explained that in my previous video that regional economic blocks would be advised, but why? So let's take a look at regional economic blocks and their purpose. So let's take the European Union as an example. Now, the European Union does a lot of things. It is far from a purely economic bloc, but in terms of economics, what does it do? Well, it has a shared currency. It also limits internal tariffs. Helps establish rules regarding consumer law. And basically just makes a more cohesive economy. So essentially, what the European Union does economically is it unites Europe, or at least its member states, under a shared economic system. And this allows for, among other things, a lot of efficiency when it comes to trade. Think about it for a second, if you would. Imagine if you're a person who is trying to set up a factory. You're an industrialist, you have the money to fund things, and you think, where should I build my factory? Should I build it here in the United States or there in the European Union? In the United States, we of course have one country, but in the European Union, you have the issue of, well, if I'm going to build it there, they don't all have the same laws. But with the European Union, that eases a lot of the economic issues there because, well, sure, they don't have the exact same laws. Poland can still have its own regulations that are slightly different from Germany's, etc. But the fact is, because most of them are on the euro, which means you're working with the same currency, they don't have internal tariffs, by and large. They have standardized consumer laws for several things, and their economy is cohesive and united. It is a lot more efficient than if the United States were to, say, have a border with Canada. Because then, if you're trying to think, okay, if I want to invest in the United States and I am operating out of Canada, I want to sell to Canadians, that's going to be an issue. In the European Union, if you want to establish a factory in Germany and want to sell to France, you can go right on ahead and do it, and you won't have to deal with much consequence. Economic blocks allow for standardization and efficiency of important things like, for example, trade laws. In fact, one of the things that made the argument for tariffs work was the argument of essentially, if people have different beliefs and policies regarding certain things like labor rights, etc., labor rights, tariffs, taxation, consumer laws, etc., then tariffs become justified because it's a way of encouraging people to invest internally into your own laws. Which, if you have laws that are, say, a higher minimum wage or lower taxes, actually, higher taxes would be better as an example. But if you have a higher minimum wage, higher taxes, higher regulation, then you want more jobs in your country, because logically, if you think these are good for people, you want more people to be under those laws and protected by them. And so tariffs are a good way of incentivizing that. With an economic bloc, it's another way of doing it without tariffs and thus taxation of goods going in and out of the economy, because everyone's working on the same rules. They agree to whatever the economic bloc's charter is and the stipulations in it, and so they operate under a shared economic entity, a shared bloc. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily have a shared currency. The EU does, and it does help. The euro is definitely beneficial in the long run, but the fact remains that its main benefit is the standardization of laws, especially regarding trade, between Europe. For example, France doesn't have as much coal. Very important, especially during the time after World War II when France was recovering from the after effects of the war. they wanted coal, and they didn't really have much in their own borders outside of their colonies, which were unstable, to say the least. And so if they needed coal, well, they would have to trade it with Germany. But if you're trading with the Western Germans, or what remained after the Germans were collapsing in on themselves following the war, well, then you have to think, well, what are the Germans going to do? They're probably going to tariff us because they want to rebuild their industry. And so, as Western Germany forms in the 1940s, you eventually have the idea of, establishing a free trade zone for things like coal and steel. And of course, this is what later evolved into the European Union. And importantly, this benefit in regards to free trade of important resources is the best advantage of an economic bloc, as the French realized when they were thinking of making something like it. If we don't have something, but someone else does in our neighborhood, then it's best to trade it with them, because it minimizes costs, and it is best for both of us in terms of trade volume if the tariffs and other regulations that make it difficult to trade between us are reduced. If the United States had a similar bloc with the rest of the Americas, an American economic union, if you will, think about how easy it would be for the United States to trade with, say, Argentina or Brazil. It'd be the ultimate form of American growth because, well, there's a lot of people and they don't have to worry about constantly different laws that are wildly apart. They don't have to worry about tariffs or value-added taxes from going in and out of the country because, well, now it's going in and out of the bloc and everyone's part of that bloc. And so naturally, things are a lot easier. Trade is a lot simpler. And thus, the economy, for everyone involved, grows massively. That is the advantage of an economic bloc. Now, I'm mainly talking about benefits here. There are some downsides. Of course, if we go the route of the EU with a shared currency, that means less control of your own fiscal policy. After all, if you need if you need a massive financial injection, well, you can't just rely on printing more money. Sure, printing money has consequences with inflation, but having that option is still something that people tend to like having, especially as a government. Furthermore, consumer law standardization means that an economy that's, say, smaller can't get around a lot of the things they would do to help boost their economy early on. For example, that lack of regulation that a lot of countries had early on in capitalist societies, that was actually very beneficial for them because it allowed a lot of companies to spring up. And sure, the working conditions were questionable at best, most of them were pretty freaking garbage, but by allowing them to get their foot in the door, they would generate the capital surplus necessary to renovate the factories, build up better and more efficient factories that put less people in danger over time. However, if you're, say, a third world country or a place that just got bombed to complete and utter garbage, see Yugoslavia, then you end up with a situation where you don't have the resources to modernize your factories, but your laws for both the consumers, which is important, but also for employees of those companies, because it's a double-edged sword, naturally leads to less funds for your factories to modernize, while simultaneously being required to modernize in order to generate the wealth needed to, renovate them, which creates several problems. And so consumer and employee-based regulations can cause issues for the lesser developed members of an economic bloc. However, as stated, there are still plenty of benefits. Increased trade is generally good, especially when it comes to rare earth minerals or other things that you can't naturally produce in your own country. Imagine if, for example, the United States and Venezuela had oil, but no one else in the Americas does. Well, not only is that not true, but let's say it was, for the sake of an argument, wouldn't you want to trade with the United States and Venezuela for oil if you're a member of South or North America? Of course you would. You need oil. It's part of the economic system that we currently operate on. And so you'd want to trade as much as possible with Venezuela. And naturally, if, say, Argentina and Canada produce rare earth minerals that the US and Venezuela didn't, they'd want to trade with Canada and Argentina because they couldn't get those minerals. And so, naturally, the economy grows around this shared need that everyone has for their stuff. And so trade helps everyone because it allows for efficiency and specialization. There are advantages that come with either being the person with the resources, or in other cases, like for example, the United States, when it comes to manufacturing and advanced technologies, due to the experiences of your people, it tends to lend to things and thus gives an advantage comparatively to other countries. So if everyone's in the economic bloc, they can afford to specialize. Denmark can't do it all, especially as a country that's relatively smaller in Europe. But they can fill their own niche in the European Union. And so it allows them to grow their economy without constantly worrying about, oh, do I need this or that? Do I have to pay these tariffs? Do I have to pay that? So on and so forth. It helps greatly when it comes to efficiency and growth of the economy, because it allows for specialization, which also allows for a division of labor among many countries. After all, if you're contributing, let's say, 300 million population like the US would, and the rest of your bloc contains so many more people, by dividing it among the many people and the large territory and the large resources of the entire bloc rather than keeping it only limited to one, well, then you allow for a greater specialization, greater diversity of what people are doing, and the workload is allowed to be spread as is best through natural free market choices. For example, if Argentina is better at raising cattle, guess where all the people who want to invest in cattle are going to go? Argentina. If the US is better for growing corn, people are going to invest in the United States. And if Mexico is better at growing sugar to make glass Coca-Cola, they're going to go there if they want that. These economic blocks allow for more efficiency and specialization. They thus allow for greater growth for everyone involved. Now again, this does lead to some problems, notably job loss in the initial years, but so long as laws regarding employees and consumers is standardized, this shouldn't be as big an issue. The big problem that NAFTA had was it was purely free trade, which allowed, for example, Mexico to take advantage of the fact that they were a less developed economy with lower regulations and see a bunch of jobs exported to them. If Mexico had agreed to standardize its laws in relation to labor and production and consumer rights with the United States, that wouldn't have happened. Or at the very least, it would be less severe. But of course, that didn't happen. See, free trade is a benefit. Fundamentally, the trade of goods between people is better for everyone because it allows for people to get better at what they do while also spreading information. After all, if Tom down the street produces a lot of really good milk, that becomes information. Information that spreads and people learn, and so they want to invest more in Tom's milk. Meanwhile, if you're really good at making chairs for some reason, then people learn that. And people go, okay, if I want to get a chair, I'll go to this guy. Now I don't have to make chairs for myself, and so I can specialize in what I'm good at. And so the loop grows, feeding both information and goods across many different areas through many different people, while ensuring that the wealth in total grows because people become more efficient, more effective, and less wasteful. You don't need to worry about carving too much in one chair and losing wood because you're better at it. You've learned. And so you can increase the production while minimizing waste. Economic blocks, especially those in regions with very similar cultures and peoples who have a long history together, allows for that to happen on a larger scale. No longer is it just like the US having different regions that specialize in different things like the steel belt, the Midwest grain production, the constant production of textiles in the South, or the shipbuilding in New England and California. Now, you have people specializing throughout the entire region. Going back to the EU, France with its wines, among other things, Germany with its industrial production and lots of just management in general, the Dutch with apparently several cruise lines, the Irish with tax evasion, that's less favorable to many, and the Danes with their obsession with Legos. Not that I'm complaining, just they produce a lot of Legos. And apparently the Swedes with furniture. See, this allows for a lot of specialization, and that's very good. Because, yes, the EU is not the United States. But the fact is, Europe divided couldn't even stand a chance to the US. With EU, they were at least able to maintain parity for a decent period. I don't think they have it anymore, but for a while, Europe was doing quite well with the EU. And it helped them greatly. It expanded their reach, grew their wealth, and allowed them to recover even better from World War II, and during the Cold War allowed them to keep up, at least to some extent, with the United States and the Soviet Union. And so, fundamentally, if other ideas allowed for this to grow in other countries, for example, if the US was able to come up with an exact draft of a similar economic bloc, or at least a similar idea, which it could use in the Americas, well then that'd be great for them. If some African country decided, hey, maybe we should establish our own economic bloc like the EU, but for Africa, that would help them greatly. Same with anywhere else, really. But the importance is fundamentally, when it comes to trade, the more free, the better. And economic blocs allow for that to be accelerated with greater efficiency. And thus, economic blocs are good for countries, their economies, and their people. That'll be all. Thank you for watching.